Welcome to Off Panel.
Yo everybody, welcome to Off Panel. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the writer of Hawkeye in the upcoming Captain Phasma book at Marvel Comics, as well as Gem and the Holograms Infinite at IDW, and much more. It's Kelly Thompson. Thanks for coming on, Kelly.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So, I want to talk about Hawkeye, which is a book I really love right now, but I really like starting with people, that come on my show for the first time. I like starting talking about the path they took to writing comics or, whatever role they have. And your path is unlike most I know because you actually started kind of on my side of things. You start when I first discovered your writing, it was when you were writing for Comic Book Resources and your column She Has No Head. Now you're writing rad superhero comics and Star Wars comics for Marvel. Where did that path start? Like, did you grow up a comics fan?
Yes and no. In my teens. That's not true because I used to read Archie's when I was really little.
Sure.
That was my first sort of gateway, but it wasn't really a gateway because I didn't buying them in the supermarket. While it was great access, I wasn't aware of comics as a form, of what other comics were out there. Like, I don't even really remember seeing spinner racks in stores. I would just see these at the checkout counter. I don't know if that's makes me a particularly non-explorative, non-inquisitive kid. I was like, well, that's what's right in front of me, so I'll have that. But I didn't become aware of like comic culture or comic stores or a larger world of comics until my teens. And like many people of a certain age, that happened largely because of the X-Men animated cartoon in the 90s.
Yes.
My brother and I stumbled across that one Saturday morning. I have two brothers, but the middle one, closest to my age, not that you guys care about this, Scott, he and I became obsessed with comics. We saw that X-Men show and we were like, what is this? It was just, our minds were just blown. It was like everything we hadn't known we needed and wanted. And a couple weeks later, I want to say, he and my little brother Dave came back from the mall with my mom and jumping up and down because he's like, look, it's the girl from the cartoon. It's the girl from the cartoon. And he had Uncanny X-Men. I always get the number wrong. It's like 280, Uncanny X-Men 280 had Storm on the cover.
Oh.
And so that became my first comic, which he had seen. My little brother, who didn't give a whit about comics, but of course also needed a gift, came in with an X-Force 3, I believe. So those were my first two real comics, quote unquote. And they were truly the gateway drug because that led to a massive obsession with comics. Enough so that I went to the Savannah College of Art and Design and studied comic books. That's where I graduated. So then from there, there's sort of however many years in between there, I wrote a novel that was about superheroes. It's called The Girl Who Would Be King. And there was a time when that idea, because it was superheroes and comics is the business of superheroes, was it was in one form a comic book. I mean, not fully, but like the idea. But I'm not a good enough artist to pull that off. And especially for young writers who don't have any money, artists should be paid. And most artists have their own ideas too. So they really don't want to and shouldn't do your idea unless you're able to pay them. And that wasn't something I could do. And so I started thinking about superheroes as sort of prose and like what that would mean and what would change about the story, what would be different, what would be more interesting. And so I ended up writing it as a novel. And somewhere amidst that happening at the same time, I started writing for my own blog, which then turned into a gig at Comics Should Be Good, writing that She Has No Head column, which is a sort of, Brian Cronin very nicely told me I could sort of figure out my own thing. What did I want to talk about? And I just said I very broadly wanted to talk about women in comics, and thus it was born. So from that, it was just writing a lot about comics, sort of getting into, I'm not someone who goes to cons and things. And so because of that, I really relied heavily on social media and making connections that way, interviewing people, talking to people, writing reviews about their work, and slowly just sort of worked my way into knowing some editors. And I was working on my own stuff on the side. And when I had something I could show someone, there you go. It was a very slow process, but it certainly worked. It's one way to go if you can't do the con thing, and a meet and greet is a really good way to like make an impression with people, but it wasn't really something I was super great at or interested in, so I sort of went a longer, more windy route.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I always think it's really interesting how, I mean, no two creators are like, no two people are like, and people always ask, like, how do I break into comics? There are so many different ways to do it, and you just happen to find your own version of it. But I did want to go back to your experience at SCAD, because I find it really fascinating. Most people know you as a writer, but you studied sequential art there. And I know, like, largely sequential art is effectively like you're approaching story and you're figuring out how to storytell and everything like that. But was your original intent to dive into comics as an artist?
I mean, I think that, gosh, I'm such a terrible artist. It's embarrassing to say that. But I mean, I think certainly that was the intention. I mean, before I discovered comics as a teen, I wanted to be a writer.
Mm-hmm.
And when I discovered comics, I was like, oh, no, this is perfect because this is writing and art. Like,
Right.
I knew I was never going to be a painter, but maybe I could be a comic book artist, which really devalues what comic book art is. But, I was an idiot. So I was definitely that person who was like creating my own characters and drawing them up or whatever. And you can find a few of my artworks here and there. I was published in a zine. I went to the University of Arizona for 2 years before I transferred to SCAD, and I would publish some pages in a local thing called Captain Spiffy's Comics. And years later, I had a blog where I did like a web comic. But, for me, I mean, I'm very interested in storytelling and how a story breaks down,
Mm-hmm.
but especially when you start working with some of these creators, they're so incredibly talented. Like, it just becomes ridiculous to think you could illustrate something yourself, because if you're at my level, because it would just suffer so much, where collaborating with someone wonderful would instead raise the thing up, instead of dragging it down. So while there was that faint hope in my youth, I've long ago put that away. Like, my time's far better spent trying to become a better writer than trying to pretend I can draw something.
Do you feel like, I mean, obviously, like going to school for sequential art kind of gives you insight that maybe some other writers don't have. Do you kind of feel like that experience of SCAD and everything like that helps you as a writer? And especially when you're working with people like, Leonardo Romero and like Jordi Belair and Sophie Campbell, and et cetera, et cetera. Do you feel like having that background helps you as a writer in terms of storytelling?
I totally think it helps me, because I feel like, unlike a lot of writers who come to comics without a lot of experience, I mean, like, you see a lot of novelists and things sometimes get pulled into comics, and I think that there's a lot of question marks about how easily they take to it right away, because it really is a different kind of storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
And not that my work is so great or whatever, but I didn't have that hurdle, because I understand that storytelling on a very fundamental level. The way I break a story, the way I approach a story, I definitely like learned how to do that, in part through drawing, but through SCAD, through taking classes that taught me how to do that. I think you can absolutely teach yourself that. There are some good books out there, and if you're interested in learning, all you really have to do is read a lot of great comics as well as some bad ones to learn how that works.
Mm-hmm.
Totally think it helps, but I've been insanely lucky in my collaborators. Like, I've had very few situations where, not that someone isn't good enough, but where it's just not been a match, where we're not really in sync. That's very rarely happened to me. And so I've just been so lucky to work with people who are usually way more talented than I am and who can really collaborate well with me, and we've been a good fit. I mean, I think it's true on Hawkeye more than anything. Leo and Jordy are such incredible collaborators, and I like to think my scripts are really good, and I write pretty tight scripts, but I think the more we've gone on, I sort of try to write to what I know Leo's interested in and what I know his strengths are. And then I always feel like I try to leave certain things open because I know he'll make better choices than I do. And every once in a while he'll be like, "Hey, I thought this was better if I did this." And I'm like, "Wow, that's way better." Thank you.
Yeah. No, I imagine that that having that background, studying sequential art and everything like that, at least prevents you from being from writing like Alan Moore scripts where it's like so dense and everything. It helps you kind of appreciate from what an artist might need and how what helps them get to the point of telling the story and everything.
Yeah, I I try to be cognizant of that, especially since Sophie Campbell was like, couldn't believe I made her draw a Ferris wheel. And then I also made her draw motorcycles. She's like, "You're the worst." And so I try to think about like what is visually interesting in a story, but what also might appeal to my artists, like what's cool for them to draw. I had to apologize to Leo because I realized that I accidentally, in issue 9, there's not only a lot of bars for a sort of cage thing, but then there's also actual cages. And I saw the pages and they look so great. And I go, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I was not even thinking about what that meant. Oh, here's a room full of cages." Like a writer just writes that line and the artist is like, "Fuck you, man." Like, what are you doing to me? So Leo was very nice about it. He's an incredibly sweet guy. So he was like, "Yeah, it's all right."
That's awesome. I love it. So I want to talk about She Has No Head very briefly because, I know a lot of people, people have a tendency of getting kind of grumpy about the idea of using like quote unquote comics journalism gigs to make your way into comics and everything like that. But that's something that's been happening for forever. I mean, I always bring up Paul Levitz. Paul Levitz started out writing zines and then he ended up, becoming Paul Levitz. I'm curious, how did the experience of doing She Has No Head, both, by yourself and then moving on to CBR and Comics Should Be Good and everything, how did that experience of writing that column help you both as a writer and in terms of just making connections?
I think it helped me in terms of connections because, there was a thing where sometimes I would write a piece that would get some good traction in the industry and like legit cool people would reach out, either creators or editors or things, and like take notice and say something nice about it, or it would help open a bridge there or build a relationship because they respected something I was saying or something. I think it also hurt me sometimes with publishers. I don't know for a fact, but I sometimes wonder if I'm blacklisted at DC because of some columns I wrote back many years ago. But I wrote bad columns about Marvel too, and that hasn't seemed to hurt me. So I don't know.
Yeah.
But so it helped from my perspective, it helped. It didn't hurt, but I don't know for sure. I mean, the idea that maybe people at DC don't want me to write comics because I said they did a bad thing, years ago, that's sort of terrifying and sad. Not just for me. I mean, personally, I hate to think that I burned bridges when what I really wanted to be doing was writing fiction. I mean, I think I don't know what it's like for other people, but for me, I mean, I never intended to get into any kind of comics criticism or journalism. Like, I always wanted to be a creator. I always wanted to write fiction. That I never had the designs on, "Oh, let me write reviews or whatever." I will say that I think writing reviews, reading good and bad comics and having to think about them critically enough to write reviews about them made me a better writer. So I think it helped in that way. I also think at one point I was trying to calculate how many words I'd written between She Has No Head and reviews and some columns for some other sites that I did. And it was like over 1 million words, which is crazy. And, that was over several years, but that can only help, every word you write. I mean, what's the rule about you're no good until you've written 10,000
hours?
10,000 hours. There you go.
Yeah.
So I think that writing 1 million words, even though none of them were fictional, it can only help,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm a firm believer that you kind of got to put in reps, and it's like, for me, in my approach, I always feel like I learn a lot more from my colossal failures, of which there are many, and I could catalog, but I will not. But
Absolutely.
it is kind of interesting how you learn from those things. Like the very first like long form article I wrote was horrible. I mean, it was horrible, and actually ended up with one of my favorite writers telling me I was staggeringly wrong as a response. And I was like,
Oh,
you know what? He was right though. And then I learned from that, and from then on, I feel like I kind of screwed up less often. So it's like it's not that I've gotten better. I feel like I've just gotten incrementally less bad.
yeah, yeah. I would agree with that for myself as well. Totally.
Well, I want to talk about Gem and the Holograms because I know creators kind of always feel like they've never really broken into comics. It's like, have I broken into comics? But I feel like if you have broken in, it would be Gem and the Holograms was your big break. How did that project first come together? And like, obviously it was. How long did it end up going in? Was it 29 issues? The first one,
26 issues plus a couple specials and two annuals.
right?
So,
So
yeah.
how much of a learning experience was diving into, a full length series like that? It's an ongoing. So, yeah.
It was big time. It was big time. I think it was definitely my break in. I had already written my graphic novel Heart in a Box
Hmm.
with Meredith McLaren. She was drawing it as I was sort of pitching, trying to get Gem. Um, I was in the running for Gem because a couple people had recommended me to some people at IDW. Um, and I fortunately had, not only did I have The Girl Who Would Be King, so I could show them, listen, I have good ideas, I can finish work, this is about superheroes, so it's sort of tangential to comics. But I also had, I think at that point, I had like 90 pages of Heart in a Box was finished. It wasn't
Mm.
published yet, but it was out there. I could send the PDF and be like, look, I know how to write comics. So that helped a lot in getting me through the door. But the biggest thing that helped was that Sophie Campbell was kind enough to partner up with me. She and I had become friends, and we'd been talking for a long time about working on something. The Gem thing came to me. I mentioned it to her, even though I wasn't supposed to. She asked her IDW editor, and he was like, yeah, you'd be great for that, blah, blah, blah. And so then it all sort of came together. But it was 100% a trial by fire. I think we got along. We killed the pitch. We did so well. It was one of those times where you're like, I want this really badly. I hope it's going to work out, but I honestly can't feel bad about it if we don't get it because I did everything I could possibly do. Like, this is a great pitch.
Hmm.
And they agreed. They loved it. And we had really good chemistry with John Barber, who was the first Gem editor. And so we were just sort of off to the races. And it was very scary. It was super exciting. And it was very scary because, there was a big launch. I mean, Gem was on the cover of previews, which, it was just crazy that the first book I was ever writing that was ever going to be published was, getting this huge launch and everything. So it was a big deal. And especially when you're working with licensors and you're reinventing a property that has a lot of fans and that's beloved, but that really has to be updated for a new audience, there's a lot of pressure. It was very stressful, but it was really exciting. And I sort of fell in love with it right away. And that sort of took over.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, and another thing too is it's probably an interesting experience when the first thing you dive into is like a licensed property, especially given the fact that you're coming in with like an existing fan base who may be kind of trepidatious or maybe, I don't know, overly excited, and it kind of puts some pressure on you, I would imagine.
There was a lot of pressure. It was one of those things where, and I would say this with Star Wars too
Yeah.
now, even though I've got more experience, it's one of those things where you just honestly can't think about it
Yeah.
because it psychs you out too bad. I was new. I was being asked to reinvent this thing that people were really excited about. I had no experience in quote published comics. Like, yes, I'd already done a whole graphic novel, but nobody knew that yet. Nobody could look at that and no readers could be like, oh yeah, okay, I get it. She's got some chops or whatever. They were like, who the hell is this? And it was definitely that thing of like, oh, even today on my Comic Vine profile, it says something like comics critic turned writer or whatever. And I hate that because what does that mean? Like, evolved into the other thing. Like, I was always the other thing. This was just another job I had, like most writers, where you're trying to get where you're going, which is not to dismiss the work I did writing reviews or anything. I put my heart into that too, but it's just a odd sort of scenario. But I really couldn't think about it too much, or I got freaked out.
Oh yeah, I can't imagine.
Had to, like, sort of have tunnel vision and like put my blinders on and ignore all the noise because it was too scary to think.
Yeah. Well, so for Marvel, when you first started breaking into Marvel, near as I can tell, your first couple credits were co-writing. Now, you probably can't actually answer this necessarily, but it's something I'm curious about. You wrote Captain Marvel and the Carol Corps with Kelly Sue DeConnick, and you also did A-Force with G. Willow Wilson, at least on the second issue. When they're first bringing you in, is it kind of like a trial run on co-writing? Is it kind of a good introduction to how they do it, or is that not really a policy type thing? It's just kind of how it worked out.
Yeah, I mean, they don't say that to you. They don't go, oh, well, we only try people out this way. I think it completely depends on the editor. I think Sana, my editor on Hawkeye, she was also the editor on Captain Marvel and the Carol Corps, and she was the editor on Captain Marvel before that. The Secret Wars event is when the thing I did was in there. I think she's a very meticulous, deliberate, and cautious editor, and I think it's to her credit. I think it's why the books that she edits are so good, because she's very careful. Mm-hmm. She doesn't leave a lot to chance. I don't know the behind the scenes of how my name got in the mix for working with Kelly Sue. I knew Kelly Sue DeConnick a little bit. Mm-hmm. I had interviewed her. I really loved her work. We'd talked a little bit. I'd asked her at one point, if she ever heard of anything that she was too busy with or whatever. I was definitely trying to break in, and she actually sent me to some editors, which directly led to me hearing about the Gem book. So it's entirely thanks to Kelly Sue DeConnick that I was even in the running for that in the first place. So, it's sort of fascinating how that stuff all locks together. But, before I was even really doing Gem, I was talking to Janine Schaefer, who was at Marvel then. I'd interviewed her and we liked each other and we had talked here and there. And I'd had this Hawkeye Investigations pitch I wanted to do that I'd been sort of nursing and working on for like a year. And so it took a long time between asking her if I could send it to her and that actually happening. There's like forms you have to sign. There's like a whole rigmarole machine that works there. But so at some point that pitch, Janine liked it and it made it to Sana. Mm-hmm. And so my suspicion is that Sana read the pitch and liked it. And that's how my name got brought up as like, hey, Kelly Sue, you are busy, you need a co-writer. What about Kelly? We'll test her out, kind of thing. And then I did really well there. And so, they let me talk to them about the next thing. So, that's sort of how it is. I mean, when I got the Star Wars annual, which was like a complete gift, mm-hmm. I was super excited about it. I wanted to do my absolute best, but I was also super aware it was a test balloon to see, well, can she do this? How well does she do this? And that helps determine whether she gets more Star Wars work or not. I mean, that's how life works, right?
Yeah.
Take this thing and don't fail at it. And maybe you get to do the next thing.
It's really amazing, though, because it's, I think a lot of times people think that comic publishers are just like snapping their fingers and then this thing is out. But it's like, it says a lot that you actually pitched Hawkeye before you even had worked on Captain Marvel or on A-Force. I don't think anybody would expect that.
Yeah, no, I had a really strong idea for Kate's stories and a Kate story, and it changed a lot from the time before I was working to Marvel till the time where we're actually talking about it. But, even when I was working on Captain Marvel, after that, Sana had mentioned, she's like, yeah, and I like this Hawkeye Investigations thing. Let's keep talking about it. But I mean, it was still another year mm-hmm. before that started to come around of like, okay, this is actually a thing we can do.
Right.
And then the development I did with Sana was huge. And then we brought in Leo and Jordy, and there was a whole, other layer of development. So it's a long process. I don't think all books get that,
Right.
but without tooting my own horn so much, it's part of why ours is so good. I think ours has a really cohesive vision, and it's very clearly laid out from issue one. And, hopefully we all get better with every issue we do, but all the pieces are there in issue one. It's not a book that's trying to find its footing, and that goes a lot to how much pre-work was put in, I think.
Yeah, I think that a lot of people probably. I actually, one of the questions I was going to ask you is whether or not this was something Marvel pitched you on, or you vice versa. And it is kind of cool. Like it really feels like a creator-driven book, and it speaks to the fact that you put a ton of work going into it.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it was definitely my idea, but like I said, it changed a lot. I mean, I think my original idea. Sorry if you can hear this kitten whining. It was definitely my idea, but like a good example of something that changed in the 2.5 years between first pitching it and it actually coming out, or it actually getting greenlit to be a thing, was, I had, the concept in mind was that Kate was doing the superheroing back in New York, and that was part of the context. Was like, okay, well, I sort of failed at this private eye thing in LA, but maybe that's because I wasn't on my home turf. I had to come home for Clint, blah, blah, blah. So that was like the concept, was it was her doing it in New York, but they were interested in taking her back to the West Coast for a variety of reasons, including the current status of things that had happened, probably also because they had Jessica Jones and Spider-Woman doing PIing in New York. They're like, we've got enough New York PI. And they were just very interested in that idea. And so, we were like, okay, well, she followed her father out here, and that became sort of the hook of why she would go back to the West Coast, and also wanting to get away from the sort of Hawkeye nonsense that was going on with Clint, that was sort of getting in Kate's way a little bit too. So, that's just one example of things that sort of evolve as you're working on it.
Sure. Well, I did want to ask, because we did experience Kate going to LA. Well, a lot of people talk about, Fraction Aha's run. Fraction also worked with Annie Wu, and they took Kate to LA, where she kind of did her own thing for a while in the very, very beloved and deservedly beloved Hawkeye run that they did. I'm curious, when you were developing the book with Sana, and Charles Beecham's an editor on the book. I don't know if he helped develop it, but was it important for you to like feel consistent with the vibe that they were doing without feeling derivative? Like, was that something you were very conscientious about?
Yeah, I mean, that was, it's funny because I'm incredibly proud of the book. I think we're doing an amazing book. I think we've got one of the most amazing books at Marvel, and I don't say that lightly. And that's thanks to my whole team, right on down the line. And yes, Charles was heavily involved in developing the book, and now he's sort of taken over as the primary editor. But it was an incredibly difficult thing to do, and I don't know that I really thought about it when I was like, oh man, I really want to write a Kate Bishop book. I'm going to figure out this pitch. I don't know. I mean, I think I was just so naive that I was forgetting, like, wait, nobody wants to follow up that run, that Fraction Hawkeye run that was like not only critically acclaimed as some of the best superhero comics that have ever been done, but it also sold well. Like, who wants to follow that? Nobody. So that was really dumb of me, but I think that we did the best we could to sort of leap off from where that was, style-wise and thematically, to like be the spiritual successor to that, while also trying to not be derivative, to try to cut our own ground. I think we're able to do that in a large part thanks to Leo and Jordy, who are, they're in the same vein as what that old Hawkeye was, but they're definitely doing their own different thing. And I think that that's great. I also think that, as much as I'd love to be Matt Fraction, I'm not Matt Fraction. So there's the derivative aspect. I mean, I can't ape him enough to be you know what I mean? Like, yeah. I just have to do my own thing and hope that it's strong enough on its own that it doesn't, just wallow completely in their shadow. I mean, we knew we were going to be in their shadow a lot, but we did all we could. But we're definitely more a successor to the Fraction Wu stuff, just because my own personal headcanon is that Kate feels very different in Fraction stuff. In David's pages when they're in New York, I feel like that's Clint's version of Kate. Like
Oh,
that's how
sure.
he sees her. She's very perfect. She's very on the ball. She's got it together in a way he can't even imagine, etc. She's still sassy. She's still great, whatever. But it's a very different version of her. She's really sort of come apart a little bit in the Wu stuff that's in LA. And to me, that's more Kate's version of herself.
Mm-hmm.
And since we don't have Clint, and since we're telling a Kate story, it was important to me that we were hitting more along the Wu stuff, because that seemed more like how Kate saw herself. So, we just aimed for that and then tried our best to do our own thing. And I think we were pretty successful overall.
Yeah, no, I mean, I love the book, and I just want to know, I in no way think that you're being derivative. I just thought it was like as you said, it's like, it's a difficult thing because obviously people are going to compare
question. Yeah, no, it's a big question. Absolutely. And I'm sure there are some people that it's not successful for. Like it's a tightrope,
Well, I mean, I really like it. I mean, I'm sure you get this comparison all the time, but I mean, it really, I was a huge Veronica Mars fan. I love Veronica Mars, LA detective, everything like that. I love that it has like these, kind of cultural touchstones, but it still feels very much like its own thing. Like a thing I really loved, a thing that makes me feel, I know this is kind of like a random example, but I love the finger guns discussion in issue 7. Like there was something about that kind of felt like it was like this evolved, confident Kate that kind of, she's still herself. She's still like, sassy and everything like that. But it also came directly after a point where she's kind of like, not really happy, and it's her kind of bringing it out because she's still got it within her. And I don't know. I mean, I feel like you're kind of evolving the character from where she came from before. So I still think it's very much its own thing.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And the Veronica Mars thing is very apt. Sana and I talked a lot about Veronica Mars, and I did a whole Veronica Mars rewatch at some point. It's definitely part of the vibe of that. And, that young female West Coast detective thing absolutely has some roots there for sure.
Mm-hmm. So I want to talk about Leo and Jordy just for a minute, or actually for probably several minutes. We'll see. But I'm curious, like, how much do you think that their specific skill sets free you up as a writer? Like, do you feel, I mean, it sounds like as the book has went along, you've been able to kind of evolve your scripts and kind of change it. So, because their strengths, right?
Yeah. I'm sorry you're hearing my cuckoo clock in the background now.
That's even better.
Yeah, I mean, I try to do that with everyone I work with, as long as, I mean, within reason, if I don't agree with, they're like, oh, I love sexualized ladies, I'm like, yeah, I'm not going to play to that strength probably, but mostly that's not been my experience. And so it's sort of like with Sophie Campbell on Gem, like I know she wants to draw a lot of like close-ups and great looking hair and things, so you just try to create those opportunities in the script so that they're having the most fun they can, or you give them openings to do the thing that they want while still serving the plot or whatever. I mean, I think it became very clear to me in issue, gosh, is it issue? I think it's issue 2 of Hawkeye, when they've got that alleyway scene,
Mm-hmm.
and Leo does these multiple Kates on the sort of alleyway. So within one panel, we've got a bunch of Kates sort of going through the frat boys there. And I had asked for that specifically in the script, but he had just executed it so much better than I had imagined it. And so that sort of ended up leading to the scene in issue 7 where she sort of takes on, in that double page spread, she takes on all those baddies in the lobby.
Mm-hmm.
And which some people have said has like a very Kill Bill vibe, which in retrospect it totally does. It hadn't occurred to me, but it completely does.
It's her own crazy 88.
Yeah, exactly. And I had asked, I think I'd asked for like 6 or 7 Kates in that, and he did like 20 some Kates. And it's so cool. It turned out so amazing. And I feel like that's the kind of artist he is. I mean, we're working really well together in sync, and I'm trying to do things that I know play to his strengths, but he's just so good that he then is like, no, 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 that's too easy. Let me do this, and he just knocked it out of the park. So, I mean, I think that, he helped me develop the Hawkeye vision. Like, he and Jordy and I had several conversations about that. Like, what should these, we tried out a bunch of different styles about what these bullseyes should look like, and how are we going to do the tags, and like what color should they be, and all of this. There are a lot of discussions about that stuff. And, they're really at the top of their game. And by the way, Leo is really young, which is amazing and also sort of embarrassing that you could be that good and be that young. He's like in his early 20s.
My God.
I know. It's crazy. I just found out. I was like, you're a baby. This is insane. You should not have that much talent in your early 20s. It's obscene.
Yeah, I mean, he is like absolutely one of my, I'm Hawkeye is the first time I've experienced his art, and he is very much up my alley. Like my favorite artists tend to be like kind of the Marcos Martin, Javier Pulido type ones.
Yes.
And yeah, like the kind of Spanish school of artists who kind of had the influence from like Steve Ditko and everything like that. And he is really perfect for the book. It's funny. I'm sure everybody brings up that splash page or the double page spread from number 7, but that was one of the things I was specifically going to bring up, because it sounds like you had a specific idea for it, like, going in, you said 6 or 7 Kates, but he just kind of went buck wild from what you had. Is that kind of like, do you try to have like a general, do you script pretty tightly and just assume that he's going to go from that? Or do you keep it pretty loose at this point, just knowing what Leo is going to do?
I do script pretty tightly. I don't know if that's just, I don't know what that is, and I don't know if my artists like that or hate that, really. Like, it's not really a thing that comes up organically in conversation, like, oh yeah, I hate scripts. I do. I mean, Sana was definitely encouraging me early on to write tight, be specific. I think that was for a few reasons. Oh, great. Now the other kitten's coming.
Oh, yeah.
I think that was for a couple reasons, including both Leo and I were pretty new. Mm-hmm. So she wants, there's some control there for her in seeing the script and in being clear about what it means and what it's supposed to be. And this is what it's supposed to look like. I think that's become less of an issue as they've seen how well we're working together and how well it's all coming together. I think, but I still do it pretty tight. And, maybe we can blame that on SCAD. I mean, not in a mean way, but, when I'm very visual, and maybe all writers are in comics, I don't know, but like, I'm one step short of thumbnailing it myself,
Mm-hmm.
That's just how I think when I think about the page and how to pace it and where those things need to land. So that keeps things pretty tight regardless, but I don't want to imply there's any sort of lack of trust with
Sure.
my artists. They always come up with better stuff, and I'm always delighted. And when there are openings where I see it could go a couple different ways, I try to make sure and put that in the script. Like, hey, listen, I've written this as 6 panels on a page, or I've written this as one splash. But if you think it works better to be like more organic and loose flowing with no panels, like, I think that could work. So, and I think then the longer you work together as a team, the more organically that happens,
Sure.
And the more your editor is willing to be like, yeah, sure, do whatever.
Yeah, once you've kind of proven like how you work, and
Yeah.
I do think that one thing that's maybe more important than, I mean, like, I think you could be as loose or as tight on your scripting as you can possibly be, but as long as you have like flexibility as a collaborator and show that trust, as you were saying, I feel like artists are going to be cool with it, because it's like, it shows that you are considerate of them and that you're also factoring in their ideas into it. So I don't know. I mean, I think flexibility is key.
I mean, as far as I know, nobody's like thrown down their pencil or their expensive Wacom tablet and been like, I'm not drawing a Kelly Thompson script. So far it's going okay, I think. But,
Good.
You never know.
I do want to say that I feel like the underrated star of that sequence, that from page 7 was, or for not page 7, issue number 7 was Letter Joe Sabino. Like, one of the tricky things about those sequences is like sometimes they're really cool, you know. It's like you're like, oh wow, this splash page is great, but then it's like, but it's really hard to read. That was really easy to read, and I don't know if that's like because of the way that Joe positioned things, or if because it was specifically planned by you guys in advance.
Well, Joe's fantastic, but and so this is not a knock on him, but because like I had written, so it's like panel 1 or DPS, you know, figure 1 Kate, and then it's like hey is the only balloon, like that kind of thing. I think I actually put this online. I'll send you a link to it. You might like it.
Sure.
But of the script versus what we ended up doing. And when I got the lettered PDF, it was, we definitely had to move the balloons around a little bit because it wasn't quite reading. And that was because Leo drew 20 Kates instead of 6. And so it was like, wait, to make this really work, let's shift all this stuff a little bit. So, you know, I mean, and that's a sort of, that's sort of a lot of the fun of comics to me. I mean, you know, seeing that team working together, I'm sure Joe is like, oh yeah, that's real fun. I love to do my job over again. But you know, getting it right feels good. And so a little bit of tweaking, I hope even Joe would agree, is cool to sort of land it in the right place. Joe's great. We just have such a good team. Although, you know, the thing I hate drawing the most ever is writing is sound effects.
Oh.
And I try to make sure to write them in and not do any TBDs, which I sometimes am inclined to do because you want to change it based on how the artist draws it. But if I write them in the script, Leo is very inclined to hand do the sound effects, which, with no disrespect to any letter anywhere, always looks better.
Oh yeah.
Because it just really it fits really organically, because it almost becomes, you know, it does become a part of the page in a different way. Sophie used to do that a lot too, and you don't realize how much you miss it until you're working with an artist who just doesn't do that. And it's no disrespect to artists who don't, but it's really adds another dimension to sort of an organic and sort of flawless, cohesive whole, you know, as opposed to, oh, here's another thing that we laid something on top of, kind of thing.
Well, and I also, and this may be like a well accepted thing that already exists out there, but I've always had this idea that artists and there's like the way that they write like by hand, like their signature versus their art style, is always very comparable. So if it feels the same, it's going to feel a lot more organic and natural without like having like some sort of like computer based font that makes it kind of feel more jagged and inorganic. So makes sense to me.
Exactly.
So I did want to ask about the Hawkeye vision, which I think is really great. And it's a really great way. I mean, it's a stylistic way to drop a lot of info really quick and also bring a lot of attitude, because she loves pointing out abs and things like that. But, you know, it's really cool. But I can imagine it could go too far pretty easily. Is that something you're like conscientious of to not overuse, or is it just all situational?
It's funny you ask that, because I'm hyper aware of it, because you know, we were doing it, you know, it was actually Sana's idea, I believe, if I recall correctly. And it was one of those things where, damn it, I wanted to think of that, because we were at that point where we knew we had a really good book we were developing, but it felt like it really needed this other thing. And we'd been talking about a lot of kind of things we could do. And Sana said something along the lines of, what if she like sees a certain way, or we can see how she sees? And I was like, oh my God, that's so good. Mm-hmm. So that was how Hawkeye Vision was born. And so then I was started developing it. And then I said, like I said, we brought in Leo and Jordy, and we were talking about what it should look like and how it should land within the book. And so the sort of general rule is that I try to use it once an issue. Mm-hmm. But even that, like early on, I was like, this is so good, but are we going to tip it? Like, is there a point where it becomes annoying? Like, we have to make sure it's useful, and we have to make sure it's not happening too much, or I worry that it becomes sort of a gimmick instead of a way to see the way Kate sees the world, which is what it should be.
Right.
So I think that's just the question. And, you know, I actually accidentally didn't write it into one of the comics, and you can probably figure it out if you go back and look. And it was probably okay to leave it out, but it felt really weird to have one issue that didn't have it. Mm-hmm. And so I went back and sort of retroactively put it in there. Um, but for the most part, it's happened really organically and it's fit. And the day when it doesn't fit anymore, I think we're going to have like a conversation about it. Like, okay, does it make sense that this isn't here, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm guessing it was issue 6.
Yes, it was. Good job.
Yeah, I was just flipping through and I was like, oh yeah, yeah. I mean, like it works, but at the same time, it definitely feels like it's a different situation than you normally drop it in.
It's like not as big a moment. It sort of doesn't land the same way. It still works,
Hmm.
and we've helped make it work even better in retrospect, I think, because for example, in issue 7, there's a shot of her seeing Larry in the coffee shop. So it's just one target like on him and it doesn't have the bullseye tag.
Hmm.
And as just like an effect of like her really zeroing in on that. And so I think that things like that help the 1 in 6 even work a little bit better in retrospect. But yeah, that was definitely it. Good call. Good eye.
Thank you, thank you. So I did want to compliment the book in another way. One of my biggest pet peeves is when you have like this amazing art team, and then like somehow like a publisher gets a fill-in artist, and it's like not a good fit. Michael Walsh was a great fit. Like I really like Michael's stuff, and I love the fact that they found somebody who is kind of he's not exactly stylistically similar to Leo, but at the same time they're comparable enough where it doesn't feel like a jagged break.
Yes, yes. I mean, listen, I'm with you on there's nothing worse than like vibing a book and then all of a sudden you get this dramatic shift in tone. Um, but the reality is you have to have these breaks for these artists, both so
Oh
they can,
sure, yeah.
live and not die, and also so that they can get ahead of the schedule because invariably you guys find yourself behind almost immediately. And so yeah, that was the plan from Go, was that we were going to have an alternate artist from 5 and 6. And again, I just have to give credit to Sana and Charles. They just get it. They know they fully understand and are a part of what the book is and what it should be. And so they brought Michael to the table, and I was like, oh my God, that's perfect. And of course, Michael is fantastic. I love him. Um, he's got a great, not every, and that's another reason Michael's a great fit, is because not every comic book artist out there can handle the sort of more street level stuff,
Hmm.
or who can make talking heads scenes interesting and important. And those have to be important to us because these are private eyes. They're interviewing people. They're doing these things that aren't necessarily super heroic. So, um, in every moment. And Michael was completely good at that. He really sort of doubled down on the noir, which is so good. And it was also great because, Jordy doesn't always color guest artists, but she loves Michael's stuff and she loves our book. And so we were able to get her to do that too. And it was amazing. So
Yeah.
I will be really anxious to hear what you think of issue 10, because we took a sort of gamble on 10, and it's a deliberate move we made, but it's risky, I'll tell you.
I mean, if it fits the story, that's all that really matters. And one thing I will say, like, I mean, obviously you mentioned the fact that Jordy liked Mike, and like, I mean, they worked together on Zero, so they actually had background
Yeah,
working together and everything.
yeah,
I think that it helps a lot, regardless of who it is. And I'm not if Jordy's not coloring 10, it still could easily work. But having Jordy tie it all together helps a lot because it at least has like a similar feel in terms of
yeah.
colors, and it's such an emotional element of the book that it helps a lot.
Totally. It's huge. It's huge. I was so glad that she was staying on for the guest artist. I actually don't know if she's coloring all of 10. It's sort of a question mark that's being decided right now. I hope it's all going to work out, though. We'll see.
We will.
Well,
So
comment.
I have one more question about Hawkeye, and it's not even like this isn't even like a useful question. I just want to talk about him. I don't know if it's Julian or if it's Julian, but I always say Julian Totino Tedesco. He's an amazing artist, and his covers are just. I can't imagine a better fit for the book. It fits it so well, like the kind of noir detective vibe and everything like that.
It drives me crazy when people don't get what we're doing / what Julian's doing. And I don't know if it's Julian or Julian either, by the way. This is the problem with social media where you never talk. I never know how anyone's name is pronounced. Um, when people don't get that we're doing like a pulpy detective noir dime store novel thing,
Hmm.
it makes me like, I just see red so hard because They're so beautiful, and it's so a part of, like, every once in a while you'll be someone saying like, this cover art doesn't match the inside at all, and I'm like, ugh. Like, first of all, is it your first day reading comics? They never match. Second of all, tonally, it's perfectly matched. It's exactly what we're doing inside, like, it just kills me when people don't get it. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's a beautiful, amazing stuff. He's one of the best cover artists in the business, and again, Sana and Charles brought him on, and they were right on the money, like always.
I have to ask, do you write, like, on number two has definitely my favorite write up on it where it says, where trouble lurks, Bishop works. Do you write those, or where those come
Uh,
from?
they've been a collaboration. I guess Sana and Charles slash Marvel, whoever wrote the first one with the adorable Archer,
Yeah.
and it's the only one I had a problem with. And I was like, I think this is a big mistake, guys. And they're like, well, do you have something better? And I was like, no. And so we went with it. And it was literally the only thing I was seeing complaints on for a while. And I was like, I knew it. I knew that was going to happen. Um, it's usually I feel like I've done a couple, um, but mostly it's been Sana and Charles doing it. Mostly, I can't remember every one. I want to say I did Where Trouble Lurks, Bishop Works, but it might have been Charles. I can't remember. Um, they're sort of, those are very hard for me to do, to be honest. Like, to like hit that mark just right of the sort of kitschy thing, and then we had a different one. Nobody Puts Katie in the Corner was supposed to be 4.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they had to change it for like legal reasons. So it went to Bye Bye Katie, which also works. But I mean, they're great. They're super fun. I keep wanting to do you know, uh, the Shadow Knows. I keep wanting to go to those. Maybe that's why I'm not as good at it as everyone else, as I want to just rip off other things.
I feel like you could do that with Madame Mask somehow. Like, I feel like she would fit with that. I don't know if she's going to end up on a cover, but she would be a good fit for that. So I just have one more question that's not related to Hawkeye before I jump into 5 questions about you. I wanted to ask about Captain Phasma really quick. I was really hyped about Captain Phasma in Force Awakens because I love Gwendolyn Christie, and she wasn't in it very much. I'm excited for the character to get unleashed in this story as it leads up to The Last Jedi. For you, what was the appeal of tackling this project? And not just because it was Star Wars. Like, what appealed to you as a writer? I mean, obviously Star Wars is pretty
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah, I mean, listen, anytime someone's like, "Oh, you get to create canon Star Wars thing," you're like, "Okay, I'm in." It's not like a really tough call. For me, it was just that, like you, I mean, I'm a huge Gwendolyn Christie fan. I'm a huge Game of Thrones fan, and seeing her as Captain Phasma, like such an iconic character, like so much charisma on the screen, even through that awesome. I mean, the design of the armor is incredible, but you can just feel her presence even through that armor. It's so awesome. And I do think that, people, we get excited for something that we see, and then we get delivered something and it's not quite what we thought because we forgot for a minute that it wasn't a Captain Phasma movie. I mean, like, I understand people are frustrated, but like, it's an ensemble piece and she's a low level villain compared to what else you've got going on. Like, what did we really think she was going to get to do in the first return to the Star Wars movies, right?
Yeah,
So
I mean, even like Dom Hall Gleason barely did anything. He just screamed really scarily.
so I think that, part of the excitement for me is that it's a character with incredible, almost untapped potential.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea that they look at the films and they go, listen, none of these are Star Wars movies. They're not Captain Phasma movies. So what can we do? Well, let's give her a novel and let's give her a comic book and let's help flesh her out for people who are really excited about what this character is about. So being given an opportunity to contribute in a real canon way to a character like that is, I mean, that's some dream come true crap. But again, I can't look too closely at it or I'll freak out. I actually just turned in the last issue this week, and it it's been like such an amazing experience, and I'm very grateful that the parameters for our comic are actually very narrow,
Mm-hmm.
and that helped a lot because I think there's, this is my whole meat dress philosophy. If you've ever seen Project Runway
Uh-huh.
back in the day or now, I don't know if it's still on or not, but you know, they would always be like these weird challenges, and they'd be like, make a dress completely out of meat, and everyone would bitch and moan up a storm. But because the parameters were so weird and specific, they would actually end up turning out this really incredible stuff,
Right.
right? And then they would go, okay, no limits challenge, do whatever you want, and they would turn out the crappiest crap that ever walked a crap way. I mean, just terrible, like the worst dresses you've ever seen. And I just thought restrictions are good, man. Like sometimes they force you to really think about problem solving in a certain way. And so our story is very unlike the novel, which is much more about her past, and which is very cool and shows you like who she was, before she was the armor, right?
Mm-hmm.
For the comic, it's a very specific, like, what did she do after she got out of that trash chute, and how did she get to the next film?
Yeah.
And so that gave us a very specific parameters, and it was really fun to create that in it. Phasma's a huge challenge for me though, because if you look at someone like Kate or even Jem and things like that, like I love sort of funny, quirky, quippy characters who like give you maximum sass, and that is not Phasma. So this was sort of outside my comfort zone, and I really enjoyed it.
That's
I actually
awesome.
the first issue I wrote was completely silent.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they didn't end up going with it. I think they were just worried that they needed more context, and so we did end up adding some, but it's definitely the shortest script I've ever written by a very long margin.
I literally just shook my fist because I was upset that it wasn't silent.
It was so cool, and I really wish it had gone that way. But like seeing the pages now, Marco Cicchetto's his style is so incredible and so realistic. But it's a complex Star Wars world, and I can see where we might have lost some readers that needed more clarity, that needed more context.
Yeah.
So they
Yeah.
made the right call. Maybe someday I'll you know get another shot.
It's rare you get that totally silent issue. I mean, even like Black Widow #1 from Chris Samnee and Mark Waid,
Yeah.
and that was I mean, it was silent until I think the last page, and like sometimes you just kind of need that tie, and I don't know, I would have been all about it, but I guess I could totally see why they'd be like a bit trepidatious about it, but
I
uh
also think that Black Widow, which is incredible, part of the reason Black Widow works so well when it's silent like that is because Chris Samnee is involved in the writing as well.
absolutely, yeah.
Like it's sort of recognized that he's an architect in a lot of ways there, even more so than usual, and I think that shows.
Yeah, I feel like the fact that the first issue was so art driven was almost like a mission statement of sorts.
Totally, I agree. I agree. How
Um,
he didn't get an Eisner nom for his work on Black Widow blows my mind.
Eisner nominations are so interesting because it's like at a certain point, it's like you could almost just pencil in certain people over and over. It's like for like Dave Stewart for forever. I feel like at a certain point they just had to like name the coloring award after him, but then he didn't even get nominated this year, so who knows?
Yeah, it's true. It's true.
So,
Well,
so
Stuart Immonen doesn't have an Eisner. Like,
which is
what?
ridiculous.
Right, right. You just are like, wait, what world are we living in? And so then you go, okay, well, Eisners are great, but they don't always get it right, obviously. See Stuart Immonen.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I want to end with 5 questions about you, the person, not you, the writer. And because I can't help, as a personal fan of the Portland area, I have a bunch of friends there. I visit fairly often. I have to always start by asking about the food. Portland is a very food-based city. So my question is, if you could only eat at one Portland restaurant for the rest of your time there, what would it be?
Yikes. Well, I haven't really been here this long, so
Oh,
I'm not gonna be great at this question, but like, I don't know, maybe Lardo.
not a
So
bad choice.
so good. But I want to just say about Portland, which I love very much. I'm enjoying it. It's a great move for us, but I've only been here a year. They may be great at food, but I'd like to see more waiters. I am so sick of the counter order, go to your table and wait thing.
Oh, sure.
When I go out, I want to be waited on. That's part of the experience, especially if I'm going out with other people. Like, I can't remember the last time a bunch of us went out and anyone ate near the same time. Instead, it's like someone's done, someone else hasn't gotten theirs yet. Who knows? I hate it, man.
Yeah, I could see that being a beef. I actually haven't had a lot of food experiences like that in Portland. Like, I know like Porcano does that, and like that kind of makes sense for like a taco place. But at the same time, that kind of takes away from the restaurant experience if that is kind of a dominating factor in a lot of restaurants. So I totally feel you.
Yeah.
Oh man, I was going to ask another Portland question. Well, this one might be more up your alley. Portland has crazy good comic shops. Do you have a favorite yet?
Well, I haven't really been there, but I love the folks at Books with Pictures. They've been so nice to me. Oh, I want to change my answer.
For
Not
restaurant?
Russia. Yes.
What is it?
Pine State.
Biscuits.
Yes. That's changed my answer. So Books with Pictures is also next to Pine State Biscuits, so that's just a bonus for them. The comic book store I've been the most to is probably Floating World, and I think they have an incredible selection. Great location, very cool folks.
I love Floating World. I'm a big fan of that. And the thing I really like about that shop is I always feel like I discover a bunch of stuff that I wouldn't discover otherwise.
Yeah.
And it fits Portland's vibe, but there are so many good shops. I really like Bridge City too. That's a good shop too.
I haven't been there yet. I'll have to put it on my list.
I recommend. It's a nice one. So next question. I'm always curious about what people listen to while they work or what they watch or whatever they do. For writers, I always feel like it's more difficult because I don't know if you're like me and you can't listen to something with words, but I absolutely cannot. So what do you listen to while you work?
I'm pretty good about making playlists for specific projects because it's very helpful to like not only to get me in the frame of mind of whatever I'm writing, but it's also a good trigger that sometimes I'll hear that song, even if I'm out somewhere and I'll be like, oh, I really feel like writing Hawkeye now. I'm like, I wonder why. And it's like, because Pavlov, you idiot, like you've trained yourself to hear the song and like write Hawkeye. So I do tend to make pretty exhaustive playlists. I do it for my novels too. I find it very helpful. I also find it helpful because I'm, home alone all day. Like sometimes I turn on the TV because I think I want that like company or that whatever, but it's incredibly distracting, obviously. So doing music is a great way to not turn on the TV.
Mm-hmm.
Thing I cannot listen to no matter what is podcasts, which is because I love podcasts and I used to have a podcast and I'd love to listen to more, but I just can't. I either stop working or I realize after 10 minutes I haven't heard a thing they've said. So
I always find myself rewinding.
Yes.
But I'm right there with you. I live way too close to my house to like really like to actually be able to listen to a lot of podcasts. And people, you would think that a person who runs a podcast would listen to a bunch of podcasts. I really don't. I just don't have time for it. And I just absolutely cannot either do my day job or write while doing it because like the words it's just like it clutters up my brain. It just doesn't work that way.
Yeah, no, I'm the same. Totally.
So I've read in interviews that you are a big X-Men fan. You obviously said X-Men animated series was like a big touchstone for you. I'm curious. Now, I'm guessing this will be related to the animated series, but who is your favorite X-Man and why?
It's definitely Rogue.
Oh, yeah.
And it's definitely because of the X-Men animated series. I mean, literally the first frame of a superhero I saw outside of like the kind of stuff that's just like in your cultural world, like, Batman or Superman or whatever, that you just sort of know about them, Wonder Woman when I was a kid. But the first thing I ever saw that began my obsession with superheroes was Rogue flying through the sky and punching that Sentinel in the head.
Oh, you mean in like the opening sequence?
Yes. In the first episode where she's fighting that Sentinel in the mall or whatever. Okay. So that left an indelible mark. And I just really like the character. it's funny because I trend now as an adult toward a sort of different kind of character than Rogue is, but I think that the Rogue of my teenage years, there's a lot of angst, there's a lot of trauma, there's a lot of strain there, and I really related to that. I mean, I was not a beautiful, untouchable, superpowered woman, but I felt pretty untouchable. I think a lot of teens do, and she was very relatable to me. And of course, the Gambit and Rogue romance was such a huge thing.
Oh yeah.
I loved it. I mean, I had X-Men 24 framed in my teenage bedroom. Like, I was all in for Rogue.
That's awesome. Do you feel like, this is not my fifth question, but do you feel like if you ever wrote the X-Men that you would have her refer to people as Sugar?
I probably would do that less. I don't really love that in writing. I mean, I'm not saying you can't
Right.
have some of that, but and it works better in a team ensemble, I guess, where
Right.
it's not happening all the time. But especially if that character's a big part of what you're writing, it just overwhelms things. I mean, like, imagine a Gambit and Rogue book written all phonetically today.
Oh
like,
my God.
it would just make your eyes cross, So I try to pare that stuff back. I also feel like, while you want that flavor, that they speak a little differently, like, they've been around in the world. They're incredibly worldly people.
Mhm.
Like, to believe that they would hold that tightly to these very specific, very deep accents is a little silly.
Yeah, I don't imagine. Well, I guess I could see Gambit calling people Mon Cherie and stuff like that more often than her saying
Yeah.
Sugar, because that's kind of like his rogue type, or not rogue. I mean, well, it is. I meant like incorrigible rogue, not like rogue character.
Right.
Of like type style, but still, like it would be kind of weird if that was just like happening all the time.
Yeah, I think he has held on to, like, this is my bit, this is my charm more, where she's sort of grown out of that a little bit more.
For sure.
But it also makes more sense for them to, occasionally use, phrasing or nicknames and things as people do, than for every little sound to be, have a, I don't know, apostrophe after it or something. I don't know. We'll
Right.
have to, someday I'll get to write them and we'll find out what mine sound like. I don't know.
I'm excited for it.
Let's hope.
So the last question I have for you is about work-life balance. I was reading at a Reddit AMA that you did where you kind of touched on that subject. And I know that's like several degrees of busy ago. That was like way, you're probably writing a lot more now than you were before. I'm curious, if you have to take a break and unwind from working, what is your activity of choice?
Unfortunately, it's TV, which explains why my health is so bad. I mean, there's so much great TV out there, or film, that when I'm not writing, I mean, the things that I love are TV, film, and reading, which are all things where you're sitting on your ass. So that explains a lot. But, I'm very bad, as my boyfriend will tell you, about work-life balance. I'm trying to get better. But I think I've come to accept that it's a thing I'm going to work on my whole life, and I'm never really going to figure out, because no matter how organized you think you are or how disciplined you think you're being, there's always room for improvement. And it's endlessly frustrating to have all this work you're doing, which you think is great, but you're still sort of not making enough money to sort of make your life secure as a freelancer. And it's very hard to find time to do longer form personal projects, like my poor Story Killer novel. The second one has this sort of long gestating failure because I just, hey, I'm busy making rent, hustling to make rent. So I think it's something I'll always work on. Since we've moved to Portland, we have some gardening, and I've really been enjoying that because we finally have a yard instead of Manhattan. But I hurt my knee gardening, which can tell you something about my health. So much for that.
Well, I do think that like the work-life balance thing, that's like, that always seems like one of the things that every creator kind of always has a hard time figuring out, because there is no one right answer, right? I mean, it's like you want to do your work, but you also want to have a life, but it's like, trying to balance those two things out. I think everybody just does kind of about as well as they possibly can.
And I don't know how people with kids do it.
Oh my God.
They're heroes, because we got these kittens 4 weeks ago. And one of them was sick for a while, and so we were having to keep them separate and things. And I was just like, how do people raise actual humans? Because I can't do it with these kittens. So they're breaking down, weeping over this kittens and deadline stress. And I was like, oh, it's a good thing I don't have a baby, because who knows what would happen.
Absolutely. Well, I'm glad I got a little bit of a guest appearance from the cats, so I appreciate the kittens making an appearance. Thank you so much for coming on, Kelly. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you so much for having me. I had a great time.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with writer Kelly Thompson. You can find her on Twitter at 79semifinalist, on Tumblr 1979semifinalist.tumblr.com, and her work at Hawkeye, Gem and the Holograms Infinite, and the upcoming Captain Phasma comic. If you're a fan of the show, there's some big news. Off Panel now has a Patreon. If you like the show and want to support it, consider backing on Patreon at patreon.com/offpanel. There are fun rewards and insider information you can get if you do. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Maxwell Schmidt, Dan Lee, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Kat McKenzie, Lou Iovino, Christopher Carter, Nicholas Kesslick, Brian Dickerson, Greg Rucka, Ryan Mayle, Adam Heifel, Nicholas Gardner, Andrew Corrigan, Fiona Staples, Chris Morris, Johan Barander, Chris O'Halloran, Mark Abnett, Matt Pataglia, Mike Murphy, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim DiMonacos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics and Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. Don't forget to like the show on Facebook at /sketched, that's SKTCHD, follow on Twitter at @sketchcomic, or follow me at @slicefriedgold. Want more from Off Panel? Subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher, and give the show a rating or review while you're at it. A quick thanks to the band Wolfpack, whose excellent track Outro from the album Volmilch opens and closes the show now. Give them a listen as they're totally rad. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.